In this set of notes, we're talking about solving linear equations, word problems, in particular where we're going to have to balance to make sure both sides of the equations are equal. We're also going to write and solve linear equations involving squares and rectangles. So our first problem talks about a car dealership that sold 78 new cars and 67 used cars this year. The number of new cars sold by the dealership has been increasing by 6 cars each year, and the number of used cars has been decreasing by 4 cars each year. The question is, if these trends continue, in how many years will the number of new cars sold be twice the number of used cars sold? So first, I'm going to start just by highlighting some key information. So we know that there were 78 new cars sold this year, and that number has been increasing by 6 cars each year. We also know that there were 67 used cars sold this year, and that number has been decreasing by 4 cars each year. And it's asking for when the number of new cars sold will be twice the number of used cars sold. And in particular, the question is asking in how many years. So that's going to be our unknown. We're going to let x represent the number of years. Now, if you think of an equation like a scale, and if you think back to the balancing Desmos activity, where we had the scale on each side. So if these two things were even, if the number of new cars was equivalent to the number of used cars, then our scale would be balanced. But it's not asking when the new cars and used cars will be the same. It's asking when there will be twice the number of new cars sold as used cars. So if you know that the new cars is going to be twice the amount of used cars, take a minute and think about how that would affect your scale. Which way would it tip? So because the number of new cars would be larger than the number of used cars, that would cause our scale to tip in this direction. This side would be heavier. So the way that we're going to bring it back to even is we're going to use this piece twice. Which side of the scale would you need to double in order to bring it back to even? If I were to multiply this side by 2, this side would get even heavier and my scale would tip even further in this direction. But if I were to multiply this side by 2, the number of used cars, that would make the right side of my scale heavier and it would bring my scale back to even. And so when I set up my equation, I want to set it up so that way the number of new cars would equal twice the number of used cars. Now I can start including my numerical information. So my new cars started at 78, and I'm adding to that 6 cars each year, and x represents the number of years. My used cars started at 67. It's decreasing by 4 cars each year, where x represents my number of years, but that's the number that I need to multiply by 2. Again, and the reason for that is because there are more new cars than used cars, so to bring my scale back to even, I would need to put more weight on this side, and the weight factor that they give me is twice. So now that I have this equation, I can solve this equation using my steps that I always use to solve an equation, which is to simplify and solve. So my first step would be to distribute the 2, which would get me 134 minus 8x. Now I'm ready to solve, and so I'm going to solve by first balancing my variables, and I'm going to do that by adding 8x to both sides, which would make my new equation 78 plus 14x equals 134. Then I would subtract 78 from both sides, because now I'm going in reverse PEMDAS, which would get me 14x equals 56. And then my last step would be to divide both sides by 14. And this means that x would equal 4. And so what this means is that in 4 years, there should be twice the number of new cars as used cars. And we can actually check this. So in 4 years, if my new cars is increasing by 6 cars each year, that would be 24 more cars added to my 78. And so that would be 102 new cars. So in 4 years, we'll have sold 102 new cars. Now for used cars, remember we're subtracting 4 cars each year for a 4-year period. So that would mean that we're starting at 67 and we're subtracting 16, which would be 51. Notice that 102 is 2 times 51. And so if I were to actually put those numbers on this scale, 51 on this side, 102 on this side, it's a little bit easier to see why the scale would have been imbalanced in this direction. But if I were to multiply 2 by 51, then that side would suddenly equal 102. So in this example, we have a similar situation where a music website is selling 94 singles and 67 albums. The number of single downloads is increasing by 22 each day, and the number of album downloads has been decreasing by 5 each day. The question is asking if the trends continue, how many days will it take for the number of single downloads to be 10 times the number of album downloads? So first I'm going to find what my question is, which is in how many days. That's my unknown. So I'm going to let my variable represent the number of days. I also know that there seems to be a factor of 10 times, whereas the previous problem, remember, it was twice or 2 times. I know that there are 94 singles sold today, and that has been increasing by 22 each day. Whereas albums, they're selling 67, and that's decreasing 5 each day. So if I were to set up my scale, and on this side I were to put albums, and on this side I were to put singles, and I want to know when this number will be 10 times the amount of this number, which of these two numbers is going to be bigger? Since singles is going to be bigger, that would mean that my scale would tip in this direction. And the way that I'm going to even it back out is I'm going to use the factor that they told me, which is 10 times, and I'm going to multiply this side by 10, because this side is already heavier, so I need to make this side heavier. So if I multiply this side by 10, that's going to be when the number of singles is 10 times the number of albums. So now I can set up my equation. So the equation that I'm going to set up is singles equaling 10 times the number of albums. So for singles, I've got 94, and I'm adding to that 22 each day, and X represents my number of days, equals for my albums, I have 67 minus 5 each day, but I'm multiplying that quantity by 10. Now that you have your equation set up, you can go ahead and solve that equation. Press play when you're ready to check your answers. So what this solution means is that when X equals 8, and X represents the number of days, so in 8 days, the number of singles downloaded should be 10 times the number of albums. We can check this by just using the numbers given to us in the problem. So singles are starting at 94, and we're adding to that 22 each day for 8 days, which would mean we're adding 176 more singles for a total of 270 singles at the end of 8 days. Now for albums, we're starting with 67, and we're decreasing by 5 each day for 8 days, so that would mean we're decreasing by 40, which will give us 27. If I were to hang these numbers on my scale, I would have 270 on the left and 27 on the right. So we can see how it would tip in this direction. This side would be heavier. But if I were to multiply 27 by 10, that would bring my scale back to even. So on this next example, we're comparing students who take Spanish and students who take French at a high school. And it says that if the trends continue shown in the table, how many years will there be 3 times as many students taking Spanish as French? So I want you to think about your scale, which side would be heavier and which way your scale would tip. And so how could you balance that out using this factor of 3 times? Also, since the question is asking in about how many years, this might tell me that my answer may not be an integer like my previous 2, and so it would be okay to round this answer to the nearest 10th or 100th. Pause the video, press play when you're ready to check your answers. If you need to check the equation, press play in a moment to see the setup of the equation. So since I have Spanish students on this side and the number of French students on this side, and there are going to be more Spanish students, that would mean that my scale would tip in this direction, and so I would need to multiply the number of French students by 3 in order to bring my scale back to even. So my number of Spanish students and my x is going to represent the number of years, would be 555, the current amount, plus 33 each year because it's increasing by 33. And I'm looking to see when that will be equal to 3 times the number of French students, which is currently 230, but going down by 2 each year. So this is the equation that you're going to solve. Go ahead and pause if you're at this point. Press play when you're ready to check your answer. So to solve this equation, I would distribute 3. Then I would collect my variables on one side. Then I would use reverse PEMDAS to get isolated. And so this would mean that it would take 3.46 years for the number of Spanish students to be about 3 times the number of French students. So next we're going to move on to problems involving squares. And so we're going to find the perimeter of each square. So if I were to look at example 4, I know that in order to find perimeter of any figure, what I would need to do is I would need to add up all the sides. The problem is my sides are not known because they depend on x. In order to know what my sides equal, I would need to know what x equals. But I would know that this red side and this blue side both equal 6x, and the yellow side and the green side would both equal 8x minus 10. That's true of either a square or a rectangle. Now in this case, I happen to have a square, which is special because remember all sides of a square are equal. So that would mean that my red side of 6x would be equivalent to my yellow side of 8x minus 10. So this would allow me to set up the equation 6x equals 8x minus 10. And so now I can solve this equation by getting x by itself. Now remember, to solve an equation, we would first simplify by distributing and combining. And in this case, there's no distributing or combining that needs to happen. And then we can start to solve. But when we solve, we first want to balance our variables. So I either need to bring my 8x term over to join my 6x term, or I want to bring my 6x term over to join my 8x term. Now normally when I have a 6x here, I would subtract it because the result would be positive. But what that would leave me with on this side of my equation would be 0. So this is actually one of the few times where I would opt to subtract 8x from both sides, even though the result is going to be negative. I actually think it's going to be easier for my brain and my eyes to process. So 6x minus 8x would be negative 2x, and on my right side I'm left with negative 10, because 8x minus 8x is 0, but I still have that negative sign in front of the 10. Then I would divide both sides by negative 2, which means that my solution for x would be positive 5. Keep in mind, though, that that's not what this question asked us to find. The question wanted us to find the perimeter of the square. So if x were to equal 5, that would mean that this side length, if x were 5, 6 times 5 would be 30. But I should also check that over here because remember it's a square and I want these two sides to be equivalent. So 8 times 5 would be 40, and 40 minus 10 would be 30. So the fact that I'm getting two equal sides is a really good sign because that means I have a square. So if each side length is equal 30, then that would mean to find the perimeter I could do 4 times 30, which means my perimeter would equal 120 units. Since I don't know if it's meters, centimeters, inches, I would just call it units. Try example 5 using a similar process as above. Pause the video, press play when you're ready to check your answer. So again, on this example, I know that I have a square, which means this bottom side, 8x minus 3, would be equivalent to this side here, 6x plus 5. This would allow me to isolate x by first subtracting 6 from both sides to get the equation 5 equals 2x minus 3. I would then add 3 to both sides, remember reverse PEMDAS, which would mean 8 would equal 2x, and then divide both sides by 2 to get x equals 4. It's really easy to stop when you get to this point because you've accomplished something and you've found out what x equals, but it's really important to remember the question that was being asked, which is what's the perimeter of the square? So in order to answer that question, I first need to find the side length of the square by replacing x with 4. And I did it in both places just to check that both sides came out the same. And in both cases, they came out to be 29 because 8 times 4 is 32, minus 3 is 29, and 6 times 4 is 24, plus 5 is 29. The fact that these two numbers came out the same means that this answer is probably right because I got equivalent sides, which means I have a square. And then to find the perimeter, that means I have 4 side lengths, all of 29, so 29 times 4 would be 116 units. So the last type of problem that we're going to deal with is perimeter of a rectangle. So it says that the length is 12 units more than the width, and the perimeter is 7 times the width. So the first thing that I'm going to do to help me see this problem better is I'm going to draw a rectangle. And inside I'm going to put the perimeter, which says that it's 7 times the width. Now I don't know what the width is, so I'm going to call that x. Now in this case, I've got a dimension and a dimension. It actually doesn't matter which side of a rectangle you call the length and the width. This could be the length and this could be the width, or the red could be the width and this could be the length. Also, sometimes you hear it referred to as base and height. Either way, it doesn't matter. I generally tend to call the longer side the length, which means this side would be the width. Now remember, I don't know what the width is, and I've already called it x, because over here it said the perimeter is 7 times the width. I don't know the width, so I've called it x, which means I'm assigning my variable x to be the width. You might also use w, and that would be totally fine. Now the length is 12 units more than the width, so that means this side is 12 plus x. Now to find the perimeter, I know that I have 2 of these, and I have 2 of these, because remember my opposite sides in a rectangle are equivalent. So that would mean I have 2 12 plus x plus 2 x's, and that's going to equal my perimeter, which they're calling 7x. So now to solve this equation, I'm first going to simplify by distributing and combining. So I'm going to get 24 plus 2x plus 2x equals 7x, which would be 24 plus 4x equals 7x. And then now I'm ready to solve, so I can subtract 4x from both sides, which would be 24 equals 3x. I'll just write that over here so I have a little bit of room. And then I can divide both sides by 3, which means my x value would be 8. Now again, I'm going to go back to my original question, which said to find the length and the width of the rectangle described. You might want to stop here because you did find x. Now x was my width. My width is 8, and I don't know my units, so I'm just going to call it units. And my length was 12 more than that, which means that this would be 20 units. And so this is the ultimate question that I want to answer. Try example 7. Again, I would start by drawing a picture, modeling it after what we just saw. Pause the video, press play when you're ready to check your answer. So on this one, I know that my perimeter is 22 more than 2 times the width, or they say twice, but I know that twice means 2 times. The thing that I don't know is the width, so that's what I'm going to call x. And it says that my length, which would be the other side, is 4 units less than. Remember, less than means to subtract 4. So 4 less than 3 times the width. So I have, to find my perimeter, I would have 2x plus 2 times 3x minus 4 would equal my perimeter, which is 22 plus 2x. I would then distribute to get 6x minus 8. 6x and 2x combine to get 8x. So I have 8x minus 8 equals 22 plus 2x. I would then subtract 2x from both sides. 6x minus 8 equals 22. Reverse PEMDAS, I'm going to add 8 to both sides. 6x equals 30. And then if I divide by 6, I just didn't have room to show that, I would get x equals 5. Again, they're not asking me for the answer for x or the solution for x. They want the length and the width. So x was my width, so that's 5, and 3x minus 4 was my length, so 3 times 5 is 15, minus 4 is 11.